All right. Another thing I want to show you that's helpful, actually I'm going to go back to collections because most people got it right, but a couple people gave me collections that were either unpopulated or they weren't target collections, so I just want to make sure everyone gets that. I'm going to make a target collection. That's the one that a lot of people missed. Create collection. I'll call it or something. And I'm going to set it as a target collection. And then, who can remember how to get things into a target collection? A quick key. Yeah, B. And it says it's going to the target collection. Any photo you hit is going in or coming out. Each time you hit B, it goes either in or out of the collection. So the only thing I found missing in the exported collections that people gave me is they didn't have the plus, so I wasn't really sure whether they were a target collection. So just know that that's a quick way of getting things organized. I don't know if Capture One has anything like that. Is there anyone who's still a little bit rough on creating a collection set or putting collections in it, or smart collections, which are a little trickier? All right, everybody's got it. Good. I'm going to show you something about spotting in Lightroom, and that is taking out unwanted dust or anything like that. First, I have to make sure that I reset these. So I'm going to go to the Develop module. All right, so you get the Library module and the Develop module. I'm going to reset the images, make sure that spots are there. Anything I do to any images that are currently selected will happen to all of them if I have this set up, auto sync. So check on yours if you're going to do anything to a series of images at once, that auto sync is turned on. If you have sensor dust, it's going to be in the same position on the sensor for a given amount of photographs you make until you turn the camera off, maybe turn it on a few times. Sometimes the sensor dust moves on the sensor. Most of the time it stays in the same place. And many times I've done shoots where a bit of sensor dust is there. It's in the same place everywhere. So I want to retouch it once and have it retouch on all the others the same way. So I've selected these three flags, and you can see a piece of sensor dust right up here. And there may be some others that are a little bit harder to see on your screen. And so notice how as I page through these, the dust sits in the same position. Here it's on the flag mast, and here it's in midair. They give you this cool tool when you're going to fix the sensor dust so you can see it all. This guy here, under your histogram in the Develop module, are a series of tools. They're all outlined in the PDF that I gave you for the Level 1 and Level 2. This one here, if you hover over, it's called the spot removal. When you click on it, you get a cursor that's a lot like the spot removal tool in Photoshop, and it does the exact same thing. You use the spot removal tool in Photoshop, it's working on actual pixels, so it's a little bit more accurate than when you work non-destructively in Lightroom. But I find that almost all the spotting I do in Lightroom is good enough and accurate enough for what I'm doing. So I can see this spot here, and there's a couple others I can see, but if I really wanted to know, and it's a real pain in the ass to work on an image, spend time on it, and then print it only to find out that there's a spot you missed. So here's what they give you to visualize the spots before you start spotting. It's right down here in Lightroom. And it turns the photograph black and white, and then it gives you a slider so you can tune how much of it you want to see. Some sensors, if they're older, they're going to have what look like spots everywhere. You can't get rid of all those, and you can't worry about them because they don't actually show up in the photograph. If you tune this down till you get to the ones that are most obvious, those are the ones you're going to probably spot and get away with. So you can literally leave that on visualize. You can turn it on and off if you want, like clicking it. You can also use the letter A if you want to. And then you just make sure your cursor is large enough. How do I enlarge and reduce a cursor? Bracket works in Photoshop and in Lightroom. You click on it, and you'll notice when you click on it, Lightroom determines where to clone or heal the place that you are spotting. So right now I have this set up for cloning, but there's a difference between cloning and healing. Cloning copies whatever the cursor sees and puts it where the spot is. That's cool, except that cloning can sometimes copy things a little incorrectly. So healing is the way the spot healing brush works in Photoshop. It estimates the texture, the color, and the location of the spot and uses an algorithm that gets smart over time to determine how to spot that piece. So if I click on here and rub a little bit with my mouse to cover it, and I have it on heal, it's sampling another part of the photograph that it thinks is very, very similar to the spot, but it's also measuring texture, color, and other things like that. It's not just copying and pasting like the clone does. And sometimes you'll want one over the other. You get to the edges, sometimes cloning is better than healing. So I'm going to turn off the visualize now. And if you look at the photograph, it looks pretty good to go. And then what I do is, if I'm spotting a few images at a time, but their subjects moved a bit, I'm going to want to check them before I say that my spotting's done. If you want to see where you spotted, you move your cursor over the image and it shows you the little spotting points, as long as this is set on automatic. The tool overlay is the part that shows you where your tool has been. And I like to keep it on auto. And the reason I like that is because when I hover over the image, I want to be able to see where I've spotted and where I haven't. And if you want to change the location of where the spotting's being healed or cloned from, you click on it, which activates it and turns it black and pops up this here. And then you can actually move the sample point somewhere else. Like if I move it over here, you can see how it's looking at the flagpole. So that's why it's going to be choosing the sky. It's pretty much a no-brainer. Any one of these can be deleted if you don't like it. You just simply select it and hit the delete key, and it gives a little puff sign and goes away. You want to redo it. So the reason that I wanted to check each image individually is to make sure that none of the spots that I did don't work. And in this case, there's one right on the flagpole, and the sample point, which worked in this photo, because it's sky on sky, doesn't work well on this photo. So in order to fix that, I want to deselect the other images so that I don't accidentally mess up their spotting. Quick way of doing that is to just click on another image and click back to the image you want. Now what I can do is make sure that I'm on this spot removal tool. By activating it, it turns kind of bright white. And then I want to grab the source for this spot. Whoops, I accidentally hit another one. Go right back to this here. I want to grab that and I want to change where the sourcing is coming from. I'll move it up on the flagpole. It's also apparent to me that the size of the spotting that I did is too much for this particular spot. So I'm going to delete that one and zoom in. And it's a good idea to zoom into any images that you spot. Here's another one that's a problem. So I'm going to kill that. Zoom into any image you're going to spot and reduce your brush. Did you guys learn to spot in Photoshop using the spot removal tool there? Okay, so this is the same thing. Why would you do it in Lightroom instead of Photoshop? Well, because if you're not going to bring your image up into Photoshop to do anything in layers, there's no need to go to Photoshop. Spotting is so fast in Lightroom and it's accurate. Most of the time it's just good enough. Occasionally I have to bring things into Photoshop to do more complex spotting than I can do in a non-destructive environment here. You've also got spotting in Adobe Camera Raw. That's also a great way to do it. And that way, when you do it in Adobe Camera Raw or in Lightroom, your smart object, if you work in it, will have all your spotting done. Because remember, you can't spot or clone or do anything on a smart object. So best to do them in Lightroom or in Adobe Camera Raw if you prefer that. Any questions on spotting in Lightroom? You guys are geniuses. Another thing that I'm curious about is how you learn to white balance your images in post. Anyone want to tell me how they were taught that? Did Jason go over that?
White balance.
Fixed color cast? Yeah, fixed color cast. Because even if you have auto white balance on your camera, sometimes it's wrong. What was that?
I mean, in the studio, we were taught to use white cards, shoot with a white card first.
Right. What if you're not in the studio?
I could like curves, like bring in the white.
Okay.
Like individually going through each color channel, like red, green, blue, and then bringing in the white point at there. I don't really ever have to like do the black point, but the white balance.
Depends on the camera, depends on the lighting condition. So auto, most people keep their cameras on auto white balance unless they're doing specific kinds of lighting work, like if you're working with hot lights, you're going to dial in incandescent, things like that. But when you're in different environments, like, pardon me, that's recording. You're shooting, I don't know, you're shooting bride and groom or anything like that. You're out in an arboretum. You've got that sunlight hitting those tree canopies. Guess what color the skin's going to be? Right? Ghoulish green when you get the image back. So you need to bring back balance there. So one thing that you can do very quickly in Lightroom is shift the bias. And they give you this tool here in the basic panel that's got an eyedropper. And when you click on the eyedropper, and remember that any tool you click on in Lightroom has some kind of option bar here. And the option bar determines how the tool works. So, yeah?
What brought up your white balance thing?
I went into the basic panel here in the develop module, and I clicked that little eyedropper. Okay. Eyedropper is basically a sampler. When you hover over your image, if you have show loop checked off, which is the default for Lightroom, then it shows you in a grid exactly what pixels this eyedropper is looking at. It even gives you the color numbers RGB down below. If you are clicking and wanting something to be dead neutral, then you need to click in a place on the image that should be neutral to your eyes, such as, you've used gray cards, so you know that that's your neutral, or you've used Macbeth color checkers, so you've got white, black, gray. Well, you're shooting outdoors or you're shooting in an arboretum and you've got a color cast. If you can find something in the image that you know should be black or white or gray, then you just click on it and Lightroom figures out what the color shifts need to be in order to get that. They don't show up here because it's doing it all in the background. So you can click around in different positions and optimize the way you want the image to look. And now that a lot of you are using laptops to do your editing, I assume, I think most of you now are probably laptop-based. I don't know how many of you use an external monitor at home. But if you don't have it calibrated, then you don't really know what you're getting unless you look at the numbers, like Ricky was saying. So this eyedropper is a quick way of getting the beginnings of white point and black point. And you can set it up so that when you use it, it still stays visible on the screen, or you can set it up to dismiss every time you click it. So you can go and do other things. And then it goes back into its little well here. You've also got curves and other ways. You've got tone curve. Yours may be in a different position here than my list because Lightroom now gives you a chance to move these into positions you want. The ones you use most frequently up top, the ones you use least frequently at the bottom. But tone curve is a lot more like something that you might see in Photoshop. But it's not quite the same as the curves with the RGB sliders. So lots of ways of getting that. The other way they give you to do it is just simply dragging the color temperature. But I like that eyedropper because it's very helpful and very realistic. So here's an image here. I'm going to reset it. So it's got a cool color cast. We have these blue skies, and even in the winter when we have cloudy skies here, they're going to put a blue cast on most of your photographs because of all the UV that's getting through. So this little guy here can color correct that really quickly. And it just makes anything you click it on go neutral. Do any of you deal with edge distortion, color fringing, vignetting on your photographs if you're using super wide angle lenses? Do you know what I mean by those things? Right? I'll show you how I deal with it in Lightroom. This is kind of a gross version of it, so I'm going to find something a little bit different. So that's the raw, and I'm just going to bring up the exposure a little bit on this picture of the painted hills. Most of the time, and you can see it here, a wide angle lens is going to give you some corner light fall off, and that's called vignetting. And sometimes it's kind of cool looking. It forces the image into the center. But luckily, there's a feature in Lightroom. It's also on Adobe Camera Raw. Were you shown how to lens correct in Adobe Camera Raw last quarter? All right, cool. This is new. Whatever I'm showing you here, there's an analog to it in Adobe Camera Raw. It's just in a different position in the interface. So one thing you can do is if you're shooting Canon, for instance, if you're using Canon lenses on a Canon body, then digital information's metadata is going into the file, and when you get that file into Cap One or Lightroom or some of the other apps, it's going to take that information and feed it into the app so that it can help you correct it. So one of the things I can do here is remove some of the problems that happen optically by using this, enable profile corrections. And what it does is it looks at the metadata of the image. It knows what camera you shot and what lens you shot under most conditions, but not all. Like if you use a vintage lens, forget it. You have to dial that in. Or if you use a Sigma or a Tamron or something like that, sometimes they don't give the same metadata. But see what it did? When I clicked on Enable Profile Corrections, it showed me that I shot with a Canon camera. It didn't list the body, but it knows what it is. And I shot with the EF 17-40, which was one of my go-to lenses when I had Canon. And it removed both the vignetting, and it also changed what's called barrel distortion. Wide-angle lenses create a little bit more distortion in the center. You're shooting a brick wall straight on, or these shelves, you're going to get a little bit of barrel distortion. The center looks a little bit fatter than the sides. It literally corrects it. It also removes something called chromatic aberration, and that's when the RGB doesn't quite line up due to imperfections in glass design. And like if you're shooting silverware, a lot of tabletop photographers get this, or if you're shooting anything outdoors with branches in the corner, or close-ups of something that's really contrasty, you'll sometimes see little greenish and purple edges. It's called chromatic aberration. And there's a button for that. I'm going to zoom in here. I'm not sure there'll be a whole lot of it in this photo, but I'll give it a try. Yeah, there is. I'm not sure it'll show up in the here. I don't know if you can see that. See that color fringing? You can see it more prominently here. Green and purple is usually what you see. If you turn this on, it fixes it. And it gives you the ability to go to the manual tab and actually tune it to how you want it to be. You can also tune the distortion correction here. That's pretty wild. But honestly, most of us who are shooting standard cameras are going to have all that stuff fed into the app, and it's going to do it. I don't know for sure whether Cap 1 can see all this, but I'm pretty damn sure it can. So these two things alone may be something that you want to do a preset for, so that every time you ingest your images into Lightroom, or however you're doing it in Photoshop through Adobe Camera Raw, if you're going to use Bridge, you can have it so that these are automated and you don't have to worry about them every time. Assuming you're shooting with the same body most of the time, your preset could be, let's say, for your Canon 5D3 or what are you shooting. And then every time you import, if that's checked off during import, I'll show you where you do that, then it takes care of all this stuff. So, kind of minuscule thing, but people get surprised when they print their images to find that, especially if you're shooting high contrast, shiny things like silverware, all the little highlights are going to have these green and purple edges, and it looks shitty. So you want to take care of it. If I wanted to include a preset that would automatically load these in as I import the images, then I could create a developed preset for that. I'll show you how I do it. Add a preset, call it and I don't want to save all of these things because I don't want all my images to end up with the same exposure and all that. So I hit check none, and then I just choose the thing that I want this preset to be, and in this case I want it to be lens corrections, and that's all. Process variations should be left on. That just tells Lightroom how to process the image, basically. So that's now a 5D3, and I'll call it Lens Correx. I hit create, and that's now a preset here that you could either click on any photos that you've shot earlier on this camera, and it'll go and look at the lens, look at the camera body, and it will make those corrections on past images, and then going forward you can have it automate during the import process. How to do that is, you remember how we did an import last week? Anyone need me to? I'll walk through that again. Gotta find something to import. All right, I'll just pretend I'm importing these, but I'm actually not. You would apply during import. This is the part where you get to ask for one of those presets to be loaded into your images as you import them, right here under Develop Settings. Last week I said leave it on none, assuming that you're not going to do anything to the images during the import. But here, I could go to my user preset folder and grab that Canon 5D3 lens corrections. Now, the preset should be smart enough so that even if you have different lenses, it applies the right profile to those lenses. So you're not saying, make all my pictures look as if they were shot with the 17-40. It's going to look at the metadata and determine how to correct it. So that's one thing that I'd say, whether you're working in Photoshop or in Adobe Camera Raw or in Lightroom, you want to kind of know how that works on your photos. And then when you did your import, it's just going to embed all that stuff. Another thing, are you guys familiar with distortion correction, parallax distortion correction? Did you guys go over that?
Yeah, I think we covered like some of this stuff super early on with Kevin Fry, right? And we all we did it a little bit.
You retilted a building and
Just a little bit.
yeah, all right. So pretty common. You're going to get things that you don't want in your final images. Even a doorway, even something subtle. You're shooting on set and you're shooting from a low angle because you want that look, and then you find out that some of the stuff in the image is kind of bent. Whether you're in Lightroom or Photoshop, and the cool thing is that anything I show you here in Lightroom has an analog in Adobe Camera Raw. It's just a little different in Capture One, but almost all the same features are there. As these software engineers get smarter and they start putting AI in the software, that's one of the things you're paying for when you get the Creative Cloud, is that as it updates the software, it's putting all this new stuff in it. You don't have to buy a new piece of software like you used to. So here, if I want to fix these buildings, and this is, by the way, the reason why I tell my students to back off from your shooting position so that you have room to fix this. If you're shooting architecture and you're not using a perspective control lens, a shift lens, you've got to leave room for the photograph to be manipulated by the software, because if you're too tight to the building, when you manipulate it, it's going to cut off all your excess around it. So I'll show you what that looks like. So if I wanted to correct for this distortion, well, if I'm doing a lot of architectural photography, I want to be at the same level as my buildings, ideally, or I want to use perspective control lenses that correct this in the lens. Like that's the TS lenses for Canon. Expensive little buggers. But the cool thing is you've got this transform panel in Lightroom, which also exists in Photoshop, in the ACR. And literally you can hit auto, and in this case it's not strong enough because it's looking at all the things that it thinks should be vertical. But then you can manually go and you can dial in. It gives you a grid whenever you use this slider. You can dial in where you want that to be, and I wouldn't try to make these perfectly upright. I would leave just a little bit of that in, possibly, because it's natural for our eye to see that. But it's also showing you how much of the picture is going to get cropped as a result of that. So once again, that's in the transform panel of the develop module. Yours is going to be down lower in the stack here than mine. And when you do this, you can choose vertical, you can choose horizontal, whatever's happening in the photo that you want to correct. You even get rotate, all this stuff. And the way I learn software is to try everything and see what works. And then you've got this checkbox, Constrain Crop, and what this does is it just crops away all the shit that's left after you've done the distortion fix, the white space. So that has done a little bit of a job on fixing some of this, but the problem is that it doesn't really know what's in the photograph, so it may make some buildings more corrected than others. So there's another way to do that. I'm going to hit this on reset. One way to do it is to just double click the word transform and it goes back to 0. Same thing with anything you do up here. If you're playing around with it and you want to go back to the way it was before you started to mess with these things, all you do is double click whatever the title is of the manipulation you're doing and everything goes to 0. So back to transform. If I want to correct these but not have them all be exactly the same, I go to guided, and that's new. And what guided does is it turns on this tool. Normally it lives here, like that eyedropper did. It just sits here. You can just grab that tool, and they give you 4 ways or 4 lines to set up to fix that. The way you use the tool is you start somewhere. Okay, if I want the left-hand edge of this building to be vertical, then I click down outside of the building and I draw a line by dragging my cursor until the line is parallel with the edge of the building. That roots that edge down and tells Lightroom that's the edge you're going to want to be vertical. If I do it over here, then it starts to understand what it is you want. And sometimes you want to back off a little bit, or you want to change it. So you can grab the ends and play with it a little bit. It's pretty powerful. They give you 4 of them so that you can also do horizontal changes. Sometimes you can even dial in another vertical, but that one's not necessary, so I deleted it by hitting the delete key. And now you see why it's helpful to have to be a little further back or to zoom out when you shoot stuff like this so that you've got correction room without losing half of your photo. Photoshop has a different way of approaching this on pixel-based images. Gives you a little bit more control of what gets cropped out, and you can rebuild some of those pixels. So right off the bat, you can fix these things before going into more complex tools most of the time. This one cropped out a lot of the foreground, so it's too aggressive for this particular photo. But when I'm out shooting these things seriously, this is just a quick shot out of a bus in Havana, then I really give myself a lot of extra photo. Yeah.
About this method. So after you use this, I can see that now it's not geometrically proportional. All buildings looks not natural. We don't see, like when we see high building, all balconies usually look smaller on the top of the building, but now it's kind of it's not.
Right.
And this green building is also, I don't know.
It's too aggressive on this photo.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's why you've got to make an artistic decision, and that's why shooting it correctly in the first place is helpful. But not everyone has access to a ladder, tilt shift lenses, or another hotel. So these are extreme examples. What's that?
I was just wondering, how did you get those lines adjusted again?
Sure, I'll turn it off and get rid of the crop. Hold on. I'm going to reset this image. So this is what you were just talking about, how these look smaller. And the thing about non-destructive editing is that it's trying to use the mathematics of metadata to make the correction. In this case, this thing is photographed so poorly that there's no way to fake that look, at least not to the educated eye that you have. But here's how I got there. When you go to transform, you've got this tool called upright, and this one here is the guided one, where if you click it, you get these things. Okay. So why would I show you a method that doesn't work as aesthetically as you want? Because in a lot of cases it does. Like if you're shooting something like the shelves or the doorway or something in your studio set and it gets a little too distorted. And in this case, it's pretty hard.
And what's the best way to, for this image, what can we use for this image to, like, remove lens distortion?
How would I use this image?
No.
Oh.
So what can you use instead of this graded method?
Instead of that tool?
Yes.
Well, this image can only be corrected to the point where it's believable. So I think that when I went to vertical and did this,
okay.
that's why I would kind of leave some of it a little bit distorted, because it looks natural to me.
Yes.
I mean, I can't really do that because of obvious
Yeah.
reasons. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And again, this is all non-destructive, meaning it's only doing it in metadata math. It's not doing it in pixels. In Photoshop, there's a very strong tool that lets you do this, but it's based on pixels. Enrique?
So when you export this, you're making a copy of the image?
When you export it,
Like, you make the correction and you export that image. What happens? It's not destructive. Then what happens to the original?
the original image is, okay, let me see if I understand that. When you export this, you're getting a second file. That's,
Okay.
I call it a daughter file to the mother file.
Yeah.
And then that has baked into it whatever you did in Lightroom.
But you still get the original.
Yeah.
Whatever the original.
Yeah, so here's the deal though. If you export it as a DNG, that DNG should contain these instructions, but if you bring it into Cap 1, it doesn't know the Lightroom instructions. Bring it into, so what I did just now, because this is a DNG, it's packaging all that information into the DNG. Remember I told you last week the benefit of DNG is it packages it all in. If it's a CR2, an NEF, or OLY, whatever, it gets that sidecar XMP file. That has to travel with that image forever. Yeah. But the cool thing is that Photoshop and ACR will see the same stuff. You get the same sliders in the same position. Remember I talked, was there another question? I thought, no. I talked to you about dust. All right. Anyone know where this was shot? Duh. All right. So I want to show you, just because I happen to notice it here in the list, I'll turn on the spot removal tool and I'll engage the visual spots, and you'll see how much money it took, how long it took me to fix this sensor. Looks like bugs. So, although it was fun to be there and great to shoot all this stuff, it's murder on the sensor. Anyway, just a little aside. But the nice thing about using this tool is I'm able to zero in on the ones that are most important. Another thing you can do is the dust and scratches filter in Photoshop. Did Jason show you that? It's pretty cool. Yeah? Is that a yes?
Jason just went over masking and selections and retouching a little bit.
Using the spot healing,
Spot healing.
cloning, yeah, a little bit.
Channels.
Yeah.
Just like a little bit, but lots of masking and select.
Well, I'm glad he did that, because that's probably what a lot of you are going to do, especially if you composite. You really have to know to make tight selections. So,
Yeah, really get into like channels though. Yeah, like selecting using channels would be like a little bit.
yeah, he has a workflow for that. It's good to know this, because I can think about the things that I can add to that'll help you in your work, and I can leave away the things that you don't need. But if anyone says, gee, you know, I want to learn about this, or I'm doing a composite and I can't get this right, or I can't make this float over that, that's when you need to tell me either on the Google Sheet or just come up to me in class. Google Sheet's great because then I can compile them all and other students can see that. And then I can add them to the course, because when I talked to Bliss about this course, he basically said, well, try to build off what was done before, which I'm now learning, and also get into the stuff that I specialize in, which is compositing. But the other side of the coin is he knows what I taught last quarter, which were advanced classes and also conceptual and portfolio. And I want to also stretch your minds creatively, but for the first few weeks, let's stay with the mechanics, and then we'll talk about clever ways of using some of these things. But thanks for your input. As far as HDR is concerned, I had told you that HDR is when you make different exposures of the same thing, and then you use software to boost up the shadows and bring down the highlights in places that you couldn't do all in one exposure. Notice that these are also slightly different positions. They're moving slightly as I click through them, and they were just handheld. So at some point I'll take you into that, but it's not something that I think you need to know right off the bat. Fog is wonderful. I love to shoot in fog, but sometimes you want to boost the contrast so the whole image just isn't in the light end of the spectrum. And as long as I see this image here, I'll just show you what this slider's for, dehaze. So this is the actual original, and after balancing, bringing up the light to an aesthetic level, the dehaze is really good because it somehow knows what tonal range needs to be corrected, and it adds a little bit of contrast, and it also controls highlights. So just something to notice. Yet I use it different ways, including on that dragster shot. So lots of ways of doing these things. Anyway, I'm probably not going to take you through every single aspect of development in Lightroom because most of it's pretty much a no-brainer. You grab the slider and you move it and you see what the difference is. But some of the things that I think are really helpful is most sensors leave a lot to be desired in capturing highlights. It depends on what you're using. So one of the things that I often do in a photograph is capture back highlights that are lost, and I'll find an example of that and show it to you. I know that you guys aren't generally going to be landscape shooters. You're going to a commercial program, but I know several of you are going to shoot outdoors and do lifestyle stuff. So you can control your foreground. You can't control your background except through exposure changes. But it's nice to know, and I suggest that when you do a shoot, let's say you're posing people in sportswear or something and they're out on a promontory or on the rocks or whatever, shoot without them and shoot with them. Yeah, hopefully you try that automatically, but always just shoot the background as well as do your shot with the people in it so that you have the ability to change the background independently later on. One of the first things I do when I get something into Lightroom or in Photoshop is I see what the automatic is going to do, because it's getting smarter and smarter. They're putting AI in these apps, and they're really able to analyze what it is you're shooting. And some of them also are smart like this. They know where you shot because GPS data is loaded if it's in your camera, and they know what it is you shot. They know that this is Second Beach and that there's sky and rocks and all this stuff. It actually knows that. This is something I was going to show you before. Let me just get to it, the DNG. Remember I showed you before that the lens corrections, no, the transform lets you correct for distortion, and I also showed you the lens corrections, which enables profile correction based on what it shot. Well, this is the actual original. It's a fisheye shot. And I deliberately shot it in fisheye just to see how this lens would work and just to get used to it. And I was curious whether Lightroom could correct that. And it didn't know what lens I used because the Sigma didn't translate that stuff into metadata, but I'm able to dial it up. So it's pretty powerful, even taking a shot as distorted as that and fixing it. It does show distortion of the pixels in the corners from having done that, but it's surprising you can even do that. And did Jason also show you what the gradient filters are? These guys up here, where you can correct to the sky and the bottom separately. Right. All right. Let me do that after lunch. You guys want to take lunch? Yeah, I'm sure you do. All right, let me stop the recording and you guys come back at, I want to say 1?
Yep.
Give you a nice long lunch? All right.